July 4th, 1946, Gdansk, Poland. The summer air is thick with tension as 200,000 people gather on Biskupia Gorka Hill, their eyes fixed on 11 wooden gallows standing in a grim row. Among the condemned, 5 young women, the youngest barely 22 years old, are about to pay the ultimate price for crimes so horrific that they shocked even the war-hardened judges who sentenced them to death. These weren't ordinary criminals. These were the female guards of Stutthof Concentration Camp, women who had voluntarily chosen to participate in some of the most brutal acts of the Holocaust. In just a few moments, American military trucks would drive forward, leaving their bodies suspended from ropes they had been forced to weave themselves from plant fibers. But how did these young German women, some barely out of their teens, become willing participants in genocide? And what drove 200,000 people to witness their final moments? Welcome to one of history's most disturbing tales of how ordinary young women transformed into instruments of terror, and how justice finally caught up with them in the most public way possible. The birth of a death camp. Stutthof Concentration Camp began operations in September 1939, just weeks after Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Located about 20 miles east of Danzig, now Gdansk, this camp would become one of the most notorious killing sites in occupied Europe. What made Stutthof particularly sinister was its strategic location. Surrounded by water on 3 sides, the Vistula River to the west, Vistula Bay to the east, and the Baltic Sea to the north, it was virtually impossible to escape from. The Nazis had chosen this location deliberately, creating a natural prison from which few would ever return. This proximity to waterways made it a hub for transporting prisoners by sea, a grim logistical advantage. Unlike the more notorious camps like Dachau or Sachsenhausen, Stutthof's early days were marked by a deceptive simplicity. It was a place of confinement, not yet the industrialized killing machine it would become, but the seeds of horror were sown early. In October and November 1939, SS officials forced Polish prisoners to dig mass graves in a forest near the West Prussian town of Nossat. These graves were for 3,500 German nationals, men and women from mental hospitals in Pomerania and Danzig itself. Under the command of Kurt Eimann, SS men executed these victims with a bullet to the back of the neck. The Stutthof prisoners who dug the graves were then shot to ensure no witnesses survived. This massacre, chillingly efficient, predated the Nazis' infamous T4 euthanasia program, revealing Stutthof's capacity for atrocity from its inception. Initially established as an internment camp for Polish political prisoners, Stutthof's purpose evolved rapidly as Nazi ideology took hold. In November 1941, the camp fell under the control of Reinhard Heydrich Security Police, officially becoming a labor education facility, Nazi euphemism for forced labor camps designed to work prisoners to death. But Heinrich Himmler's visit in January 1942 sealed Stutthof's fate as a full-scale concentration camp. Impressed by the installation's potential for mass murder, Himmler officially designated it as part of the Nazi camp system. What followed was an industrial-scale expansion of death. By 1944, as Soviet forces pushed westward, Stutthof became a critical destination for death marches from camps across Eastern Europe. Thousands of Jewish women from Auschwitz-Birkenau, survivors from ghettos in Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, were forced to walk hundreds of miles to reach this coastal prison. Those who survived the journey found themselves in a camp designed to strip away their humanity before taking their lives. The statistics are staggering. At its peak, Stutthof held over 100,000 prisoners. The camp's gas chambers could kill up to 150 people per day when operating at full capacity. But perhaps most chilling of all was the systematic way the Nazis recruited young German women to help carry out this genocide. League of German Girls. The making of female killers. The Nazi regime understood something crucial about human psychology. Evil is often most effective when it wears a familiar face. This is why they invested so heavily in recruiting women for their concentration camps. Approximately 3,700 women served as guards across the entire Nazi camp system, with many of them stationed at Stutthof. These weren't hardened criminals or sociopaths plucked from society's margins. They were ordinary young women, many recruited directly from the League of German Girls or Bund Deutscher Mädel, BDM, the female branch of the Hitler Youth. From the age of 10, German girls were indoctrinated into Nazi ideology through mandatory participation in youth organizations. Under Gertrude Scholz-Klink, the Reich's women's leader, the BDM preached the mantra of Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. They were taught that their highest calling was to serve the fatherland, to produce racially pure children, and to view Jews, Slavs, and other undesirable groups as subhuman threats to German civilization. The League of German Girls didn't just teach domestic skills, it prepared young women for war. By 1939, membership in the BDM was mandatory for girls aged 10 and up. The 1940 BDM yearbook included Hitler's call for all women to integrate themselves into the combat community, accompanied by photographs of smiling young girls and patriotic slogans. These seemingly innocent youth programs were actually sophisticated recruitment pipelines for the Nazi war machine. When the war began demanding more personnel for the concentration camps, the SS turned to these ideologically prepared young women. They offered decent wages, housing, and most importantly, a sense of purpose and power that many working-class German women had never experienced before. Some 8,000 women served as communications helpers, operating radios and teletypes across occupied Europe. Others, around 3,500, took on darker roles as SS auxiliaries or SS Helferinnen in concentration camps. The training these women received was deliberately brutal. SS instructors taught them that physical violence wasn't just permitted, it was required. They learned to use whips, clubs, and their own fists to control prisoners. More insidiously, they were taught to view their victims not as human beings, but as dangerous enemies of the German people who deserved whatever suffering they received. What's most disturbing is how quickly many of these young women adapted to their roles. Within weeks of arriving at camps like Stutthof, ordinary German girls were making life and death decisions about who would live and who would die, often with a casual cruelty that shocked even their male SS colleagues. The BDM's indoctrination, coupled with the promise of status and recognition, transformed ordinary girls into agents of terror. The high-heel killers of Stutthof. Among the most notorious of these female guards were 5 women who would eventually face the gallows together on that July morning in 1946. Their stories reveal how ideology, opportunity, and individual choice combined to create monsters wearing human faces. Ewa Paradis, the sadistic selector. Ewa Paradis was born in December 1920 in Lauenburg, a Polish city under German occupation. Raised in a Protestant German family, she had what appeared to be a normal childhood, attending local schools until 1935 when she dropped out to begin working drifting between jobs in cities like Wuppertal. When war broke out, she heeded Hitler's call, joining the BDM in 1944 at age 23. In August 1944, at just 23 years old, Paradis arrived at Stutthof's SK3 camp for training as an overseer. The 2-month training program was designed to strip away any remaining empathy these women might have felt. They were taught that showing mercy to prisoners was not just weakness, it was treason against the German people. By October 1944, Paradis had been assigned to Stutthof's Bromberg Ost women's camp, where she immediately distinguished herself through her cruelty. Survivors testified that she would eagerly await the arrival of new prisoners each morning, arbitrarily deciding who was fit for work and who would be sent directly to the gas chambers. She seemed to relish this power over life and death, treating it as a game. During morning roll calls, Paradis would strike prisoners with sticks across their faces and bodies, laughing at their helplessness. In the brutal Polish winters, she developed a particularly sadistic ritual, pouring ice-cold water over naked women and forcing them to remain motionless. Any movement would result in savage beatings that often left victims unconscious in the snow. Her sadistic games extended to the gas chambers, where she arbitrarily decided who lived and who died. Survivors described her as playing God, relishing her power over life and death. Her reputation for cruelty impressed her SS superiors so much that they transferred her back to the main Stutthof camp in early 1945, where she was given the responsibility of selecting prisoners for immediate execution in the gas chambers. When the camp could operate at full capacity, Paradis was personally responsible for condemning up to 150 people to death each day. Elizabeth Becker, the young accomplice. Elizabeth Becker represents perhaps the most tragic case of ideological corruption. Born on July 20, 1923, in Neusetz near Danzig, she was still a teenager when the Nazis rose to power. She married young in 1936 and became a proud member of both the Nazi Party and the League of German Girls by 1938. When her homeland became part of the Third Reich in 1939, Becker was overjoyed. She worked in agriculture until 1944, living what appeared to be a normal rural life. But in September 1944, at just 21 years old, she volunteered to become an SS overseer at Stutthof's women's camp. Despite her youth, Becker quickly proved herself capable of extraordinary brutality. She participated in selections for the gas chambers and was personally involved in the camp's evacuation procedures, which often involved abandoning prisoners at sea or forcing them into death marches. One of the most damning pieces of evidence against Becker was her involvement in the evacuation of prisoners by barge. On May 5, 1945, a barge carrying 370 starving prisoners was towed into Clintham Haven in Denmark. Only 351 survived the journey, and documents bearing Becker's signature showed her direct involvement in decisions that led to the deaths of the others. After her conviction, Becker appealed directly to the Polish president for commutation of her death sentence. The court even recommended clemency, noting her young age and arguing that she had committed fewer crimes than the other defendants. But Polish President Bolesław Bierut rejected the appeal. At 22, Becker was barely more than a child, but she had chosen to participate in genocide, and the price for that choice would be her life. Jenny Wanda Bachmann, the beautiful spectre. Jenny Wanda Bachmann was perhaps the most enigmatic of the condemned women. Born on May 30, 1922, in Hamburg, she was considered strikingly beautiful and had initially hoped to become a fashion model. When the war made that dream impossible, she chose a different path, one that led directly to Stutthof. In 1944, at age 21, Bachmann applied to become an overseer at the concentration camp. She was one of only 3,700 women to take such positions out of 55,000 total guards across all Nazi camps, making her part of a very select group of female perpetrators. Bachmann quickly earned a reputation as one of Stutthof's most brutal wardens. Survivors testified that she showed no hesitation when beating prisoners to death with her bare hands. She regularly selected women and children for the gas chambers, choosing victims who were too weak or sick to work. Her beauty and brutality earned her the nickname the Beautiful Spectre, while others called her Mad Jenny. When Stutthof was liberated, she managed to evade capture for 4 months before being arrested at Danzig train station while attempting to flee by rail. Even during her trial, Bachmann seemed to treat the proceedings as a performance. She flirted with her male guards, changed her hairstyle daily, and showed more concern for her appearance than for the lives she had destroyed. When sentenced to death, she was heard saying that life was a pleasure, and like every pleasure, it was bound to be short. During her interrogation, Bachmann had the audacity to claim she had always treated Jewish prisoners well and had even saved some from death. But dozens of survivors testified against her, describing atrocities so horrific that even her own lawyer admitted her guilt while arguing she must be mentally ill. Wanda Klaff, the silent sadist. Wanda Klaff remains the most mysterious of the 5 condemned women, not because she was less brutal, but because she was more reserved and spoke little about her crimes. Born in Danzig in 1922 to German parents, she lived an unremarkable life until the war changed everything. Her father was a railway worker, and she finished school in 1938 before working in a jam factory. In 1942, she married Willy Klaff and tried various jobs: minus housewife, streetcar operator, never staying in any position for long. It was as if she was searching for something to give her life meaning. In 1944, she found that purpose at Stutthof Concentration Camp. Initially assigned to the Prices subcamp, she quickly gained a reputation for brutality before being transferred to the Rauschen subcamp in present-day northern Poland. Like the other female overseers, Klaff supervised daily roll calls, but she turned these routine procedures into opportunities for sadism. She would sometimes organize multiple roll calls per day, standing at the barracks entrance with a whip and striking each prisoner as they exited. Some inmates tried to escape through windows, but this often resulted in worse beatings. Survivors testified that within a week of Klaff's arrival, every prisoner's body was covered in bruises from head to toe. Some died from their injuries, while others were sent to the gas chambers when the beatings left them too weak to work. Klaff fled the camp in early 1945, attempting to resume her normal life, but she was arrested on June 11, 1945 by Polish officials. While in prison, she contracted typhoid fever and experienced some of the suffering she had inflicted on others. During her trial, Klaff showed no remorse. She claimed she was simply devoted to her work, admitting to striking at least 2 prisoners every day, though witnesses testified this number was vastly underestimated. At 24, she would join the others on the gallows. Gerda Steinhoff, the ruthless climber. Gerda Steinhoff worked at Stutthof for less than a year, but in that short time she established herself as one of the camp's most vicious guards. Born in 1922, she spent her teenage years working as a domestic servant on farms near Danzig. When the war began, she found work in the city, first as a cook, then as a tram conductor. In 1944, after marrying and having a child, Steinhoff's connections with Nazi soldiers stationed in the area led her to learn about staff shortages at Stutthof. Without hesitation, she applied to become a guard, fully aware of the camp's reputation for brutality. Steinhoff proved to be an eager student of terror. Within months of joining the camp staff, she was promoted to block leader in the women's camp, placing her in direct authority over female prisoners. Survivors described her as participating enthusiastically in selections for the gas chambers and taking sadistic pleasure in inflicting pain and suffering. Her dedication to the Nazi cause was so impressive that on December 1, 1944, she was promoted to senior guard and transferred to the Bromberg Ost subcamp. There she received a medal for her loyalty and service to the Third Reich on January 25, 1945. She was described as utterly devoted to her job and known as an extremely ruthless supervisor. When the war turned against Germany, Steinhoff tried to flee home, but she was arrested on May 25, 1945. During her trial, she showed no remorse and made jokes throughout the proceedings. When asked about her activities and whether she had ever hit prisoners, she claimed to have had a purely bureaucratic job with no direct contact with inmates. Unfortunately for Steinhoff, approximately 200 of her former prisoners had survived to testify against her. Their accounts of the horrors they suffered at her hands were so compelling that even her attempts to portray herself as a mere paper pusher couldn't save her from the gallows. The one who escaped justice. While these 5 women faced execution, one of the most notorious female overseers at Stutthof managed to escape with her life, highlighting the arbitrary nature of post-war justice. Hertha Bother, born in 1921 in Teterow, was known throughout the Nazi camp system as one of the most brutal female guards. Unlike many of her colleagues who were barely literate, Bother was well educated and articulate. In her youth, she was known as helpful and caring, even assisting her classmates with homework. But joining the League of German Girls in 1939 changed her fundamentally. After excelling in a 4-month SS training program at Ravensbrück in 1942, Bother was sent to Stutthof, where she earned the nickname the Stutthof Sadist. She was one of the few female guards trained to use firearms, and she used this skill liberally, shooting prisoners on a whim. During daily dinner periods, Bother would punish 7 to 8 prisoners by withdrawing their food plates, denying them bread and water. She constantly humiliated inmates and sometimes left them to die alone. Her cruelty was so extreme that even male SS guards were shocked by her behavior. In January 1945, Bother led one of the death marches from Stutthof to Bergen-Belsen, with a brief stop at Auschwitz. When British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen in April 1945, they found her there still in her SS uniform. During the Belsen trial in September 1945, Bother denied all accusations despite multiple witness testimonies. Incredibly, she was sentenced to only 10 years in prison for using her pistol against inmates. Even more remarkably, she was released early on December 22, 1951, as an act of British clemency. Bother changed her name to Lang and lived freely in Germany until her death in 2000. While her 5 colleagues faced the gallows for their crimes, one of the most brutal women ever to serve at Stutthof spent less than 7 years in prison and died peacefully in her bed. The hunt for justice. The capture of these women wasn't accidental. It was the result of a systematic effort by Allied forces to hunt down war criminals. As Soviet forces approached Stutthof in early 1945, the SS began evacuating prisoners and destroying evidence of their crimes. The evacuation of Stutthof began on January 25, 1945, when nearly 50,000 prisoners, mostly Jews, remained in the camp system. Many were forced on death marches westward toward Germany, while others were loaded onto barges and ships for transport across the Baltic Sea. These final evacuations were catastrophic. Hundreds of prisoners were forced into the sea and shot. Over 4,000 Jews were crowded onto small boats bound for camps near Hamburg or along the Baltic coast. An estimated 25,000 prisoners, half of those evacuated, died during these final transports. Soviet troops finally liberated Stutthof on May 9, 1945, finding only about 100 prisoners who had managed to hide during the evacuation. The liberating forces immediately began photographing the camp's ovens and gas chambers, creating the documentary evidence that would prove crucial in post-war trials. The hunt for the female guards began immediately. Soviet and Polish authorities worked together to track down SS personnel who had fled westward. Some, like Bachmann, managed to evade capture for months, but one by one they were found and arrested. The trials began in early 1946 before a Polish court in Gdansk. The proceedings were methodical and thorough, with prosecutors presenting evidence of systematic murder, torture, and crimes against humanity. Dozens of survivors testified, their accounts creating an undeniable record of the defendants' guilt. What emerges from the trial transcripts is a picture of young women who had chosen to participate willingly in genocide. Unlike many male SS guards who claimed they were following orders or feared punishment for disobedience, these women had volunteered for their positions and taken pride in their work. The final day, July 4, 1946, dawned clear and warm in Gdansk. Word of the execution had spread throughout the region, and people began gathering on Biskupia Gorka Hill hours before the scheduled time. The city administration, fearing mob violence, had arranged for a massive police and military presence, but they also facilitated attendance by giving factory workers the day off and providing transportation to the execution site. The preparations had been grimly improvised. Aloisi Nowicki, the vice-deputy of Gdansk prison, had been tasked with organizing the executions, but finding materials proved difficult. With no proper ropes available, he had forced the condemned prisoners to weave their own nooses from plant fibers. Finding clergy to minister to the condemned proved equally challenging. All local Protestant ministers refused to participate, claiming they couldn't remain impartial. The secret police finally located a German minister hiding in Sopot and forced him to serve as chaplain. They found him cowering in an attic, dressed in his clerical robes and clutching a suitcase. The execution method chosen was deliberately crude. Unlike the Nuremberg trials, where professional executioners were employed, the Stutthof executions would be carried out by simply driving trucks forward and letting the condemned drop. No effort was made to ensure quick deaths through proper neck breaks. The women would die by slow strangulation. As the morning progressed, the crowd swelled to an estimated 200,000 people. Factory workers, farmers, Holocaust survivors, and curious onlookers packed the hill. Those who couldn't get close climbed trees and scaled building roofs for a better view. The atmosphere was part carnival, part religious ceremony, part mob justice. At the appointed time, a convoy of open American military trucks arrived carrying the 11 condemned prisoners. The 5 women and 6 men had their hands and legs bound with cords, and their faces were uncovered. The crowd would see everything. The trucks backed up under the waiting gallows. Simple cord nooses were placed around each prisoner's neck. According to witnesses, most of the condemned accepted their fate quietly, though documents mention that 1 man and 2 women struggled and fought with their guards. The specific identity of these resistant women was never recorded. When the preparations were complete, the truck drivers received their signal and drove forward simultaneously. The condemned dropped, and the slow process of strangulation began. Without proper drops to break their necks, some of the prisoners struggled for several minutes before losing consciousness. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Many threw stones at the hanging bodies, while others rushed forward trying to cut pieces of rope or tear fabric from the corpses as souvenirs. The belief that such mementos brought good luck was widespread among the local population. Military guards had to fire warning shots into the air to control the crowd. When Jenny Bachman's truck initially failed to start, leaving her standing with a noose around her neck, the crowd let out a murmur of frustration. That's when a former Stutthof prisoner ran forward and pushed her off the truck bed himself, ensuring her instant death. The medieval scene continued as people flocked to the swaying bodies, desperate for souvenirs. Eventually, military commanders ordered the bodies cut down quickly and transported to the anatomy theater at Danzig Medical Academy, where they would be used as teaching aids for medical students before being disposed of as biological waste. The broader context of justice. The Stutthof executions were among the last public hangings in Poland, representing the end of an era of visible communal justice. Just 17 days later, on July 21, 1946, the final public execution took place in Poznan with the hanging of Gauleiter Arthur Greiser, former president of the Danzig Senate. But justice for Stuthof's crimes didn't end in 1946. As documents have revealed, the systematic nature of Nazi crimes means that prosecution continued decades later. In 2018, 94-year-old Johann Rebogen, who had served at Stutthof between 1942 and 1944, was brought to trial in Germany. Because he was under 21 when he committed his crimes, he was tried in a juvenile court despite his advanced age. In 2019, SS guard Bruno Day was convicted at age 93 of contributing to the killing of over 5,000 Stutthof prisoners between 1944 and 1945. These late-life prosecutions raised complex questions about justice, memory, and the passage of time. Perhaps the most remarkable case was that of 96-year-old Irmgard Furchner in 2021. As a former secretary at Stutthof, she was charged with complicity in the murder of over 11,000 people. When authorities came to arrest her, she attempted to flee in a taxi from her retirement home in Quickborn, but was captured within hours. During her trial, Furchner had to be brought to court in an ambulance, strapped into a wheelchair, and wore a medical mask due to COVID-19 protocols. At 96, she became possibly the oldest person ever tried as a juvenile, since she had been only 18 when she worked at Stutthof. These modern prosecutions highlight how the crimes committed at places like Stutthof continue to demand justice, even as the perpetrators and survivors pass into history. The 18-year-old secretary who typed deportation orders became the 96-year-old woman facing judgment for her role in genocide. The execution of the Stutthof female guards represents more than just the end of 5 individual lives. It marks a moment when post-war society grappled with questions of justice, revenge, and healing that remain relevant today. The public nature of the executions served multiple purposes. For Holocaust survivors and the local Polish population, it provided visible proof that Nazi crimes would not go unpunished. The massive crowd that gathered on that July morning wasn't seeking mere entertainment. They were witnessing the restoration of moral order in a world that had been turned upside down. For the broader international community, the Stutthof trials established important precedents about individual accountability for genocide and crimes against humanity. The principle that following orders was not a defense for participating in mass murder would later be enshrined in international law, but the executions also raised troubling questions about the nature of justice itself. Was public hanging appropriate punishment for these crimes? Did the carnival-like atmosphere around the executions diminish their moral authority? Were these women victims of indoctrination as well as perpetrators of evil? These questions become even more complex when we consider cases like Hertha Botha, whose crimes were arguably worse than those of the executed women, but who received a light prison sentence and lived freely for decades after her release. The arbitrary nature of post-war justice means that survival often depended more on luck than on the severity of one's crimes. Today, Stutthof exists as a memorial and museum, preserving the memory of the estimated 65,000 people who died there. The camp's history serves as a reminder not just of Nazi brutality, but of how ordinary individuals can become complicit in genocide when the right conditions exist. The gallows on Biskupia Gorka Hill stood for only one day, but the questions they raised about justice, revenge, and human nature continue to challenge us nearly 80 years later. In the end, perhaps that is the most important legacy of July 4th, 1946, not the spectacle of public execution, but the enduring reminder that individuals matter, choices have consequences, and the price of moral blindness can be measured in human lives.